Good morning. Well, we're coming towards the end of the story as Luke records it, and yet there are still quite a few years to go, because we finished off yesterday with the riot in Jerusalem and Paul declaring himself to be a Pharisee and therefore creating division amongst the people who were attacking him. But after this, he becomes aware through his family. You see, we hear nothing about his family. But his sister was obviously living in Jerusalem, and she or her son become aware of a plot to kill Paul. And Paul sends his nephew to see the centurion to tell him what's going to happen and claim his right of protection as a Roman citizen. The centurion, realizing the truth of this, sends Paul off to Caesarea and to Festus, who was the governor up there at that time. And so Paul and Luke travel up there to Caesarea, and there Festus examines him. But the Romans have great difficulty in understanding what the problem is all about. And they have this difficulty because they, of course, worshipped a multitude of gods. And in the stories and myths told about this multitude of gods, they often had stories about gods becoming incarnate and all the other myths that went around these particular legends. And he has great difficulty in understanding what the problem is and what's causing this problem. And so he quite simply puts Paul in prison. It's a very light imprisonment, probably a house arrest that he gets there at that point. And while he's there, he is still visited and he is still able to communicate with people he knows and waits there for several years. And then Festus gets replaced. And he gets replaced by a person called Felix, a new governor. And this new governor again looks at this prison he's got, and again he can't really understand what it's all about. But he decides, well, in that case, the best thing I can do is to send him back to Jerusalem where they can work out this problem where it first arose. Now, Paul realizes that if he goes back to Jerusalem, there's going to be trouble. And the people there waiting for him are not only going to catch him, they're going to arrest him and they're going to kill him. And he is a Roman citizen. And once again, he is not afraid to use this particular right because he says, I will not submit to this particular decision. I claim my right as a Roman citizen to be tried in Rome. I appeal to Caesar. Felix has to submit to this because Paul, as a Roman citizen, had this particular privilege. So he put him back in prison. A little while later, a local king turns up called Agrippa. And Felix tells him about this strange prisoner. But he says, I have a problem because when I send him to Rome, I don't know what the charge is. I can't make out what he's been doing or what's caused all the trouble. So Agrippa says, I'll listen to him and see if I can make sense of it for you. So Agrippa calls him up and says, now tell us, Paul, what's happening and why you've been caught, this trouble has been created. And Paul again speaks now to Agrippa and Felix and explains the gospel. He never loses an opportunity of explaining the gospel. He explains it so thoroughly that Agrippa himself says, Paul, do you think you can convert me at this particular moment? And Paul says, well, except for the fact that these chains, I don't want you to have the chains, but apart from that, yes, I want you to have everything else I've got, which is to become a child of God. And after it's over and he leaves the room, Agrippa turns to Felix and he says, he could have been released, There's no real charge here. But he's appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar he has to go. And the story goes on. The story goes on about Paul traveling to Rome. We get the story of him going on the boat, and we get the story about the storm. We get a story about him shipwrecked on Malta, again ministering to the people on Malta and healing people there and explaining the gospel. Paul was always explaining the gospel. And then he travels up from there, and finally he arrives in Rome. And he's met by the people, Christians in Rome, who have heard that he's coming. But when he gets there, of course, there's a long court cases, long time to wait, and he's put in prison there for 2 years. And I think it is during this time that Luke, who is still with him, because he says, Luke, still the faithful physician, he is still with me, looking after me. Here in Rome, Luke sets down the account of the gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, which is going to be presented to the magistrates in Rome when the case finally comes up for trial. But Paul is still preaching, still receiving visitors, still trying to educate the church and explain to Christians what the faith is really all about. Well, he finally comes to trial in Rome. And the Roman magistrates, just like Felix, just like Festus, just like the centurion in Jerusalem, look at the case and they read the case. And just like Gallio in Corinth says quite simply, you know, this is not a civil case. This is just arguments about religion. And they set him free. So we remember that this is maybe recorded by Luke as the end of the Acts of the Apostles. But in fact, Paul had a longer ministry again, which went on in different parts of the world. Amen.